June 1989. For weeks, hundreds of thousands of Chinese students and workers had defied their authoritarian leaders and camped out in Beijing's Tiananmen Square, calling for change.
I think it was a revolution in the making. People, for the first time, were questioning authority in China, and that had never happened before.
The protesters had captured the world's attention, while the Communist Party struggled to deal with this growing people's movement.
It really was a movement of the whole society. This was a citizens' movement.
While some in Tiananmen Square sensed their protest could not continue, few imagined how brutal the end would be.
We have anticipated that we're going to be cracked down. Real ammunition, tanks running over people, that is out of our imagination.
But the spirit of resistance did not die. In one of the 20th century's most defiant acts of bravery, one man became the symbol of the Tiananmen Square protests.
That heroic man was able to turn the tank around and stop it. Why then, facing so many students peacefully retreating, that tank never stopped or slowed down, but instead charged at us and caused so much damage?
I wasn't preparing myself to be in the center of one of the biggest major tidal waves that arguably reshaped the world.
Tiananmen Square, Beijing, the heart of the world's most populous nation. It was here that Mao Zedong declared the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. His picture still gazes down from the gates. Mao's Cultural Revolution, a decade-long series of purges until his death in 1976, had brought great suffering to the Chinese people, with liberties squashed and people imprisoned, tortured and killed. After Mao's death, and having survived several purges himself, Communist Party leader Deng Xiaoping led China into a new era, opening the economy up to the West.
Deng Xiaoping, who had been under arrest, came out again and said, why don't we try capitalism? Socialism isn't really working, let's try capitalism. And so all of a sudden, China became a very exciting place. Suddenly people were wearing colors instead of just blue and gray Mao suits. They started wearing red, green, yellow, and there was this idea that maybe the West wasn't such a bad place after all.
But political reform was not moving at the same pace as economic reform.
There was a sense that China was coming out of a shell and moving forward. And then in '87, an anti-bourgeois liberalization campaign, and some famous intellectuals were purged, and the secretary of the party who was pushing these reforms was purged, and Hu Yaobang.
Hu Yaobang was forced to resign for his support of the student uprising of 1986. His efforts made him a hero for thousands of students demanding greater freedom.
Although we didn't necessarily agree with Hu Yaobang's ideas, we really sympathized with him. Lots of students thought that Hu Yaobang was at least a very enlightened leader.
Hu's death on April the 15th, 1989, 2 years after his public shaming, was the catalyst for a protest that would become the biggest modern China had witnessed.
We needed an excuse. And then when Hu Yaobang died, we thought a similar, commemorating a former General Secretary of Communist Party is not something that outrageous. I mean, it's something people can do. Government wouldn't be able to just suppress that.
What started as a protest at Hu's treatment grew in momentum. Emboldened, the protesters wrote a list of demands. They poured onto Tiananmen Square.
As university students, we felt we had a social responsibility to fulfill, and we were passionate about our country. The demands made at the time were worthy and just, from dealing with corruption to speeding up the political reform, from media freedom to law and democracy. They were the kind of desires shared by all students in the 80s.
The demonstration started to take the form of an outdoor rock festival.
I think when the students went to the square, the people were amazed. A spontaneous demonstration hadn't happened before, so people were really surprised and a little nervous and a little curious, but also it was almost joyous because the students were waving flags and the weather was good.
I walked into Tiananmen Square in April 1989 by coincidence. It was purely for curiosity. You start listening to the students' public speeches, and they were intellectuals. They were so good speeches, and I was so much inspired.
As the protests continued, the students' demands grew. Soon they started asking for democracy.
I think the word democracy misled a lot of overseas viewers because they immediately thought, oh, well, they understand what majority rule is in elections. No, the students didn't understand that. To them, democracy just meant, get off our back.
We probably don't know what democracy is living in China, but we have a pretty good idea what totalitarian is, what is non-democracy is.
Unsure of how to quell this growing dissent, China's rulers tried publicly denouncing it. On April the 26th, they published a damning editorial in the People's Daily newspaper, calling the protests anti-party and anti-socialist.
Because the labels anti-party and anti-socialist are so divisive and so strong and so frightening that when you get those labels put on you, you know that a line has been drawn in the sand. I mean, their parents may have been sent to labor camps for 20 years for that kind of label.
That editorial was a blow. People went, oh my God, this is the Communist Party pronouncing its verdict on what it's going to do. So people were really angry, really upset.
Rather than turning the population against the students, the editorial had the reverse effect. In support of the students, policemen, journalists, government workers, and even some members of the armed forces joined the peaceful protests.
On some days, there were 1 million people in Beijing on the streets, and the population then was only 10 million. And so I think everybody was on the streets. I almost couldn't find anyone who hadn't been part of a protest. And if you weren't actually marching, you were gawking.
The editorial also widened a rift within the Communist Party itself. On one side, the moderates, led by Secretary General Zhao Ziyang. On the other, hardliners, led by the Premier Li Peng. Both sought to influence the country's ultimate leader, Deng Xiaoping, on how to resolve the standoff with the protesters.
People like Zhao Ziyang were saying, okay, that editorial is out there, but it was a mistake. Revise that editorial, then we can talk with the students and we can solve this peacefully. Deng Xiaoping's face had been involved in that April 26th editorial because ostensibly it was his words and his decision. So for him to have to backtrack would be a loss of face for him personally, which he wasn't willing to do, especially with people like Li Peng and others pressing him not to do it.
On Tiananmen Square, the students began organizing themselves into unions.
My experience can prove that this movement is quite a spontaneous one, because I jumped in quite randomly, and in 1 week or 10 days, I came to the highest position. I became the president of the Independent Student Union of all universities in Peking.
With people all over China taking to the streets to openly call for change, the communist state looked fragile. conservatives within the party now started to lobby for a forceful response. A confrontation seemed inevitable.